Guys, my name is Bobby. I'm with Bowigens Beer Company. I am one of the co-owners and head brewer here. I appreciate you guys coming out, spending some time with us tonight and talking about some recipe formulation. So, right before we get started, guys, if you need a beer or anything too, Lola's over here about the bar. Help yourself.
Thank you, Lola.
All right, let me get things situated here.
Sucks. You have an iPhone charger?
All right, so just kind of gauge the room a little bit. How many people here have been brewing for over a year? All right, most everybody, awesome. And as far as like all grain to extract, who's using the all grain now? Mostly everybody, perfect, because that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So, if you are doing extract brewing, that's fine. There's still a lot of information that I can go over that will be able to help you benefit in your recipe formulation. But a lot of stuff, it might get a little bit technical as well. So we'll do a little Q&A towards the end. If you guys have any questions in the meantime, if there's something I say that you're kind of confused by or anything like that, just let me know, raise your hand. I'm happy to kind of talk through any of that. So, like, kind of dive right into it. When I first started brewing, my motto was more of, don't relax, I'm gonna worry and probably dump some homebrew. Which was the opposite of a lot of stuff. Because I knew going in what I wanted to do. I knew I had a goal and I wanted the beer to be perfect. When it wasn't, it was a source of frustration. A lot of that frustration can kind of come from not knowing your ingredients well enough, not knowing your equipment well enough, or figuring out the process. All that stuff that kind of comes through with experience while you're brewing is also stuff that can help you when you're formulating recipes, knowing what to do, knowing your different malts, your hops, your water, get through all those profiles. So, I'm going to kind of talk about my approach. It might be a little bit different. I take more of I would say an artistic approach to recipe formulation and brewing, as opposed to more of an engineering route. So if I'm kind of a little bit more this and there, then don't be mad if you're an engineer if you need it. Exactly right, I apologize. But what I like to do is kind of start backwards. I start at the end. I like to picture when I'm formulating a recipe, I think about what do I want out of this beer? What do I want it to be like? I kind of vision it, picture it in the glass. What's the color? What's the clarity like? What's the head retention like? Hopefully it's right. What's the aromatics of that? What does the beer smell like? What does it taste like? What's the mouthfeel you get? Are you picking up any notes? Is there caramel? Is there toast? How's the finish? Is it dry? Is it sweeter? Kind of start envisioning that, and I'll work my way backwards. I'm gonna mute myself. All right. So when you're picturing this beer, when you get an idea if we want to do a recipe, you can either a few different routes. Maybe you want to recreate a classic style. If that's the case, then a lot of the work's done for you because there's a lot of information out there about classic styles, the BJCP guide, a lot of recipes out there you can kind of start forming your own style off of. Or maybe you want to create something that hasn't been done before. Maybe you had a weird food pairing. You're eating a banana and a peanut butter sandwich, and you're like, I need to make this into a beer, which we've actually tried to do before.
Elvis would have loved that.
Yeah, right?
Peanut butter and banana is
It's a
delicious.
classic combination. So if there's, whatever sparks your interest, whatever, sparks your imagination of what you can brew, maybe there's a random ingredient you saw somewhere at a store, and you're like, yes, I need to put that in the beer somehow and not fuck it up. So,
Hashtag relatable.
what I start with, again, you're envisioning the beer.
Voice for.
Hold on. I
CD.
turned it up, I'm sorry. Let's try and turn it up. Sorry, guys.
Voice change for a minute. I apologize. So anyways, what I like to do is, I'm kind of old school, so I do like to get out a pen and paper, start writing down just ideas I have. You don't have to get too technical with it. But start writing down, okay, if I envision like this, I need these specific malts. Do I get, toasty flavors? What kind of malts I'm going to use to put that in there? What kind of hops do I want in there? And it's kind of more generalities of building that profile. Then you can start doing some research too. If there's different styles you want to base it off of, start to, research the internet, look at different textbooks. Brewing classic styles will get you a lot of good information. There's a plethora of great books out there designing great beers that can kind of get you in the ballpark. Once you have an idea of some of the ingredients you want to use, then I'll turn to a program, Beersmith or ProMash or something, and start really kind of dialing in your process and dialing in what you want the beers to be. So After that, the biggest thing I kind of stress at the beginning is know your ingredients. If you haven't had experience with certain malts, obviously the maltster will have some information for you about what to expect with those. Same thing with different hop varieties, yeast varieties, but the best way to do it is get your hands on it. Get some of the malt, smell it, taste it, make a little mini mash, make some hop teas, just immerse yourself in those ingredients so you kind of learn. Make sure you take notes. If you don't take notes, you're not going to learn, you're not going to improve. So once you have that down, then you can start like getting your general processes down, get your parameters, your original gravity, your final gravity, ABV, IBU. What do you envision this beer as? That's going to help you start to make those building blocks of what that beer is going to be, how much grain you're going to need to do this. So the last thing you're going to need to know while you're designing that is your system. You have to know your numbers of what's your efficiency like, what's your boil off rate, how much evaporation you're going to lose, what are you going to lose in transfer. That will help determine what yeast you're pitching, how much of it, a lot of different stuff. So once you know your system and know your ingredients, you're well ahead of the game to be able to design your recipe and start making this beer. So one last thing to consider as well is consider your technique. Is there a new process you want to use? You want to try out first wort hopping? Are you going to do an extended boil? Is there different new remashing or decoction mashing or something else you want to try? So make sure that's in the back of your mind as you're building your recipe. What's your process going to be like, and do you need to adjust that with your system and with your ingredients? So with that being said, I like to start, when I'm building the recipe, start with malt. Most of your recipe, 75 to 100% of it is going to be your base malt. So your two-row, your Maris Otter, pale malts, Pilsner malts, different stuff like that. You want to build your base malt, and depending on what kind of style of beer you're doing, maybe it's a English brown ale or a Belgian style triple. Generally, I like to use those indigenous malts from those countries to start off with. If I'm doing a Belgian triple, I'm probably going to use Belgian Pilsner malt. If I'm doing an American IPA, I'm definitely starting with two-row, but you can experiment with that. That's the fun of brewing. You can combine different base malts, get your complexities, so you don't have to use just Maris Otter. If you're doing an English brown malt, you can throw some other stuff in, but just kind of know where your starting base is. So like I said, 75 to 100% of those, obviously you can do smash beers, and to really learn that process and learn those ingredients, that's a great way to do it. After that, I like to use what I call a signature malts. So that would be more to your little bit highly kiln malts or higher kiln malts. So your biscuit malts, Munich, Vienna, Victory, things like those are going to add a little bit more texture, a little body in that beer. So you'll get some toasty notes out of that. You'll get more of that roasty bread kind of flavors. I try to keep those malts within about 10% of the total grist bill. At the same time, you can start to add in some of your crystal malts. Now, crystal malts have already been processed, so they have the sugar. You don't have to convert those, so you got to be careful when using your crystal malts. It'll add a lot of sweetness. It'll add some body to the beers, but you don't want to overdo it. I try to keep crystals as well under 10%, or at least at 10% of the total bill. And with that said, to know your crystal malts. If you use Crystal 20 and Crystal 40, it does not make Crystal 60. Each one has its own flavor profile. So just, again, taste those malts, smell them, make little mashes with them, and just kind of learn what each subtlety adds. The more you learn your ingredients, the better you can build this beer up and get your base together. After those malts, then the last, we can call them accent malts. These are your highly roasted and killed malts. These are your roasted barleys, black patent, special B, even on the crystal side. So these you want to use sparingly. They are more harsh, more intense flavors. So I typically use 5% or less of these in the malt bills, depending on which one out of the beer. But if you start to use, again, there's exceptions to everything. This isn't a hard, fast rule, but this is kind of where I start building my bases and building up the beer. So those malts, like I said, they'll add more of that punch, not always pungent, but more intense flavors. So just use caution when adding those malts on top of it. And now at this point, your beer will kind of start taking shape. You can kind of start painting a picture. You have your base and it's filling out a little bit of color with your accents and signature malts. And you can also, there's obviously more malts you can use. There's wheat, there's oats, there's rye. Each one has its own specific, variety of what it can add to the beer. And there's different flake versions. There's raw versions. You can get into cereal mashing at that point, which I don't do a lot. I don't see a whole point in it. A lot of stuff's converted for you already. So if I'm using oats and stuff, I'm going more towards the flake variety. But just the more you learn about your ingredients, the more you have in your arsenal to create this beer. So after we start to put together the malts, there's other things you can add. We'll start adding in different sugars for different beers. And this has a wider range of different effects. The more complex sugars, you'll get your honey and your maple syrups, your lactose. You're going to start adding some sweeter flavors, more of a body, more mouthfeel to your beer. Or you can go the other route, more simple sugars like your dextrose will start drying the beers out. Like a lot of times in like Belgian style ales, we'll use cane sugar or beet sugar, Belgian candy sugar, that will help dry that beer out, drives up the alcohol, and helps create more of that bigger body. And it's a drier body, but it helps create a big fluffy head on those Belgian style beers. But it helps those bigger beers not be as boingly sweet. It helps dry those Belgian styles out. In American IPAs, I'll use a little bit of dextrose sometimes, help dry that out so you can get that pure hop flavor. It takes down the body a little bit in some of those beers, helps it finish dry like American IPA style should be.
That sounds like a trade secret.
A little bit. I'll slide a little bit out. Keep feeding me a beer. So one last thing to take into consideration about your malts is, especially your base malts, keep an eye on your diastatic power. Diastatic power is something that your base malts have. It's the ability for them to convert their starches into sugars themselves, the ability for them to have those certain enzymes. So your base malts will have plenty of diastatic power, even all the way up to your standard Munich malt. It has enough to be 100% Munich beer and still fully convert itself. But you start to get more into those highly kilned malts, those different specialty malts, they can't convert themselves, so you're going to need a lot of those base malts. So you just want to make sure there's enough of those in that mash to help it fully convert itself. And I'm going to move on to hops unless there's any questions on the malts right now. Talked about, but
on your darker malts, do you actually put those in with your mash at the beginning, or do you actually just like layer them on top of like basically rinse in your sparge or whatever?
I do both. Most of the time I'll add most of the dark malts in. Black Patent is one that I'll kind of, depending on what I want to use it for, I've done it before where I'll add it in at the end. I'll do it with the Horloff just to add that color in there without getting more of that burn, that roastiness, extreme roastiness on there. So there's variations you can do. You can experiment with cold steeping, cold steep some of the malts and blend them back in towards the end of the boil or whenever you want to add it. Just depends on what do you want to do with the beer. What do you want out of it? If you just use a Black Patent for color, then throw it in towards the end. You don't need to add anything else if that's what you're going for.
I have a question that kind of piggybacks off that. That's cool.
Yep.
So like your flaked oats, your flaked wheat, stuff like that. You ever add those later into your mash process to try to help offset the grain absorption, seeing as how those tend to absorb a lot more wort than say your standard grains?
I've done it on accident, not on purpose, but yeah, I've forgotten to add in some flaked wheat before. But no, I normally for grain, I try to stick with a mash ratio of 1.5 quarts of water per pound of grain. When you're around 1.5, it's kind of right in the sweet spot. I've gone down to 1.2, which is an extremely thick mash. Doing a lot of stirring, especially on our scale. It's a fun day. Amanda loves it.
Arms are jacked.
And then some brewers go a little bit higher, and a lot of the German brewers like to go upwards of 2 to 2.2. And it helps them. They have a thinner mash, but it helps with decoction mashing and stuff like that. But I feel like you're playing a game with that when you're messing around with your ratios. The thicker you get, the less of that area is for those enzymes to travel around and start converting. If you get too thin, then they're floating around and they're not grabbing all the starches they could. They're not converting as much because there's just too much room to float around and not enough of those starches available. So for me, I'd like to stick around 1.5 because I feel like it's perfect. And as you know, that was a random tangent off of your question, but as far as gram absorption, yeah, I haven't had too many issues with that, so I throw everything at the beginning.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So the aspect as far as like when you mentioned the like, okay, you kept to 10% of this specific malt and like 90% of that. How do you gauge how much pounds of malt to use in the aspect of a system? Because if someone's brewing at 5 versus maybe 5 barrels,
Yeah.
how do you know how much pounds of grains to use in that conversion?
So that's when it kind of comes back to knowing your system. If you start with percentages, it just kind of helps you scale. So if I do a beer with percentages at 5 gallons, I can do that same percentage at 3 barrels. But I have to know what's my efficiency, what's my loss going to be, what's my boil off rate, and so you can kind of judge by that. So when you start building that recipe, you can use those percentages to scale around. But you have to know what your output's going to be.
Related question, when you're scaling up from
Yeah.
a small size batch to the next, you're taking into account your efficiencies, differences in efficiencies. Do you do that for every individual grain or just for the overall amount?
Yeah. So both. I'll start. That's why I kind of start with those percentages,
Right.
and then I adjust the overall bill. So if I know when I'm doing 5 gallons, if I get 85% efficiency
Right.
versus 70, I'm gonna start off, bring everything to 70, and then tweak from there.
So then you have to do the efficiency before you go from there. Okay.
Does Beer's Beef does that?
What's that?
Beer's Beef does that?
You can do that in Beer Smith, yeah.
The conversion.
Yeah. And then you start to learn. There's little tweaks. It's not always just a perfect, change scale up, but doing the percentages, it'll get you really close, and you can start dialing in from there.
So efficiency is basically trending over batch time, figuring out where you're supposed to come in from a gravity and where you did come in, and then you adjust the efficiency.
Exactly, and it changes from the type of beer you're doing, obviously as well. So if I'm scaling up a 6.5% beer, I know what to scale up my efficiency as versus if I'm doing a 10% beer, that change is going to be different. So when we were learning here and we were scaling everything up, it took a little learning curve to figure out. I'm scaling low 9 up. It was different from if I'm scaling our fall of velocity imperial stout. Efficiency was different. There was a different loss. There were different ratios from how much degree of temperature I'm losing, even on mash in, stuff like that. So besides that, there was no hard fast rules. I was trial and error, taking notes, figuring out this is what I need to do when I scale up. And then,
Does the efficiency go up with the bigger beers?
it goes down a lot.
It goes down?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's more grain in, it's less room for those enzymes to work. A lot of times I'm maxing this thing out in mash tun, filling it up. So I have to go down to 1.2, 1.25 parts per pound, and that really kind of stresses the amount of output I can get.
Did you ever pull any of it out?
To do
Pull the
like,
mash out, pull the grains out because you had too much in? I've done that.
No,
I was just asking.
I've gotten dangerously close, but luckily, like we've had the mash tun here and the grain all the way up here, and we stir for about 20 more minutes, and we can get it in. All right. So we're gonna move on to some hops. So a lot of people categorize your hop additions into a few different categories. You have your bittering additions, which generally your 60-minute addition. Can be a little bit later. I've done 90-minute additions and stuff whenever you're doing extended boils. You have your flavor addition, which is generally 30 minutes or less, 30 to 20 minutes. And then once you get under 20, you get your aroma additions, which generally like 5 minutes and less is where you want a lot of your aroma additions. A lot of these prized hops that are coming on now that you don't want to boil off those volatile oils, paid way too much for them, and they're glorious as is, so you're gonna put those in right towards the end near the whirlpool, 5 minutes and stuff. But so when you're building this up, again, I like to think of it, these building blocks, I'm building this recipe. I have my malt profile. What hops do I want to accentuate that? Obviously, it's going to start one with what are you brewing. If you're doing more English varieties, then you know what kind of hops you want to use. But if you're doing more experimental, more American styles, You have obviously all your citrus, piney, resiny flavors. You have your New Zealand, Australian hops, which add a lot more tropical fruitiness. And they kind of go to pine, woody, really unique flavors. So just kind of know what you want to get coming in, and then I like to look for kind of complementary flavors when you're doing that. If you're doing an American style, then obviously there's some English styles that can be a crossover. You get some more earthy, herbal kind of flavors can kind of balance with some of the piney, resinous flavors as well when you're building some American styles. So again, when you're looking at hops, if you haven't used it before, try to get your hands on some, smell them, make a hop tea, rub in your hands, give it a sniff. You can kind of get a good idea of how it's going to react. So I try to build those kind of flavors up, and I try to stick to, generally, I won't use more than 4 to 5 varieties in a beer. I've definitely done it to success and failure, but like most of our IPAs, we do at least 4 to 5 different varieties. Sometimes you're great with just one, and sometimes you can mix 2 or 3 that you know work well together. It's kind of figuring that out. We have one of our beers, our Tropical Fusion IPA. We use a hop called Meridian. A lot of people haven't used it or have any experience with it. And we've done a single hop version of that with Meridian. And it came out okay. It was like subtle melon, kind of fruity flavors, but nothing outstanding. But combined with Mosaic and Citra, and it just kind of lets those shine, but it adds the solid backbone that really helps that beer pop out. So, and that's, you're not going to learn that from reading a sheet. You're going to use it from using these different hop varieties, making different combinations, and learning from that. So, something else to take in consideration when you're picking different hops and your process is different hopping techniques. We talk about your bittering addition, your aroma, and your flavor additions, but you can consider first wort hopping when you're adding in hops through the lauter coming in. Those hops stay there for the full boil, but technically it's considered generally around like a 20-minute addition. It's more softer, supposedly kind of feel to it, and aromatics, not as much harsh bitterness. There's hop bursting where you're adding in your big charge of hops towards the end. I'm not a big fan of not adding anything for bittering. It freaks me out. I still need a little something. So generally, even up in the hop bursting, I'll add like a 20-25 IBU charge, kind of give it a backbone, and then hit it at the end and go to town on my late kettle whirlpool additions and stuff. And then obviously dry hopping, you can experiment with that. I'm a big fan of doing multiple stage dry hopping. I don't like to do just one addition. I feel you can add a lot more complexity if you're doing 3-day, 5-day, 7 days, different style of dry hopping. You don't want to leave them on too long. I try to leave anything on really over 10 days, or I think the most I've done is 2 weeks on an experimental when I was doing. But within those, even we were talking earlier about some of the New England IPAs. We started dry hopping at day 4, and just did 3-4 different additions all throughout fermentation. There's a lot of different science behind that. You can get different aromatics and different compounds and stuff coming out of the hops, which is really cool. There's a lot of science behind it, and there's a lot of non-understood science behind it. A lot of people are testing it, so it's a lot of different experimentation you can do. You just don't want to leave the beer on the hops too long. You'll start to get those grassy, vegetable flavors and stuff. So whatever you do, have a plan going in. Experiment, try something. If it works, awesome. If not, then you make notes and move on. But as far as hops go, we had a question.
Have you used cryo hops?
I have.
Dry hop?
Yeah. I don't believe I've dry hopped with them, so I can't give you any data on that. I've used them. Last year for our top brew beer, we had Cascade cryo hops, and they were, essentially, I would say like a super Cascade. It was like 18% alpha acids. So that's something else to kind of pay attention to, is obviously your alpha acids when you're building your recipe. Know your IBUs and know, obviously, the longer the hops are in the boil, the more of those alpha acids will isomerized and it'll build up that bitterness. But you want to pay attention to what kind of hops you're putting in when the higher cumulone hops generally can lead to a little bit more harshness. So you just want to kind of pay attention to your numbers and the hops and stuff. But as far as the cryo ones, I've used them once. We had a good experience with it. It was just less hops. We used like 4 ounces when we normally use like 1.5 pounds.
Yeah, I heard that on dry hop, when you dry hop with cryo hops, you don't get that too grassy taste when you
Yeah.
leave it long.
I can see that. It's more condensed.
Concentrated.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that.
There's been a couple of beers recently, IPAs, one's from Stone, I forget the other one that's mentioned, Incognito with Mosaic. Is that an extract of some sort where they're actually controlling the temperature that they do the extract at? Because I can't find anything else on it. That's what it seems to be.
It says it's incognito mosaic.
Yeah. I think that's an extract.
I can't-
That's, I Googled it.
Yeah,
I Googled it.
At first I heard of it, so I'm not for sure.
Yeah, nobody's saying a lot, but from what I'm seeing, it appears to
I mean,
be.
I would be Stone could pull some new process by themselves. I would have the resources. So.
It seems they're saying that they're actually
Yeah.
doing an extract at like below 170 degrees, so
Okay.
they don't get isomerization,
Gotcha.
things like that.
Yeah, that, like I said, there's with hops, there's a lot of new science coming out, a lot of understood and a lot of not understood when people are experimenting. And that sounds awesome. I will look it up when we're done here, but starting now, I heard it.
I just saw, I read the labels and I actually, oh, this is interesting.
That's what you should do. Like exactly, if you're trying new beers, taking notes, writing stuff down. Now you're gonna look it up, but once you learn all those ingredients, or maybe you find one, you're gonna find this. And like I'm gonna brew a beer with this now, and figure out what it does. So that's the beauty of it. Sir.
I've never done the hot teas.
Yeah.
How do you suggest doing that?
So I would, heat up water, you can boil it, and then split in the hops. I'll let it soak for about 30 minutes. If you want, get a cheesecloth, filter it out, pour them out in little glasses, and then you can kind of smell the aromatics, give them a little taste. You don't want to drink too much of it; it's going to give you a headache.
Dumb question. How much should you put in? A few pellets.
Yeah, just a little bit, not even like half an ounce. Probably less than that.
Yeah, when I did a beer school for us about a year ago, I made 1 gallon samples.
I think I was there at night. I just don't remember. I'm old.
Yeah, it was. It's all good. But no, I did 1 gallon batches. Added a little bit of DME to give a little bit of a malt backbone to it, so you kind of get a play on what the
That can help
sweetness and
a little
bitterness
bit,
is.
yeah.
But I did like 1 ounce for a 1 gallon batch, and it let it steep for like 15 minutes or something like that, and then I pulled it out. So
Yeah, and the DME is a good idea because the way hops react with water is going to be a little bit different than the way it acts with maltose and the different sugars in beer. So
Your thoughts on temperature for dry hop?
So there's different schools of thought depending on who you ask. I'm a proponent of, I try to get it around 60 degrees. I drop it a little bit for my fermentation temperatures on my ales. I like 60 degrees because I can drop most of the hop cone, I can take the yeast off, and then I'll dry hop it there. The hotter it is, I feel you get more hop character from it, but it can be too fast. I don't like to dry hop at high, like full fermentation temperatures unless I'm doing something weird like I talked about the New England IPAs. Some people crash their beers and then dry hop. It can work, but I feel you get a lot less of those aromatic properties because the beer's already cold. There's hardly any compounds leaving those hops that are leaching out. So I like.
What about 50 degrees?
I like 50 to 60
Drop it
degrees.
to 50,
Yeah.
dry hop, and then drop it out before.
Yeah, I like 50 to 60 degrees. I think is a sweet spot for it.
that's good to know.
Now, when you mentioned the aspect for dry hopping, that it was better per se in the active fermentation or afterwards in that regard?
In that regard, I like to do it after active fermentation.
Okay.
Just after, once I normally start around day 10.
Right.
Once I know primary between 7 and 10. After that is over, then I'll start dry hopping it. I'll conduct my yeast here, collect it, and move on, or you can rack to a secondary. The only exception I could talk about when I'm dry hopping and active fermentation, and that's just to kind of mess with the biotransformation and try to get new cool flavors out of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's where you start talking about your New England IPAs, where
Yeah.
you're trying to get it at high Krausens when you're probably doing your first hop
Right,
emission.
and we've started experimenting with that, and the rule is when you're experimenting and you're changing things, do one thing at a time, so you can kind of track that difference. With those beers, I've done a lot of different things at the same time, so I've gotten good results out of it. I can't tell you if it's specifically because I dry hopped on day 4 or not, but it's something that we were messing with.
Just tell me you haven't added flour to your recipe for those, right?
Not at all.
All right.
Absolutely not.
Chris wanted to try that thing.
I was still jump to that same question, but I'm guessing you dry hop during, after, and after.
You
What is the difference between the two?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was just talking about. With the main time I've done that, the active fermentation has been through the New England IPAs, where I've done a lot of different techniques for the first time at once. So it's hard to say if it's specifically for that, but in those beers, I mean, I've dry hopped, over 3 pounds per barrel in that, and 6 pounds per barrel actually. So I've done some excessive dry hopping with that, so I think it's a combination of a lot of those things. But a good experiment to do would be to try one of your known recipes. If you want to try it, throw some hops in high Krausen and make changes. Make that the only change you do, and then let me know.
And he'll buy you a beer.
Anybody else? Good. We're gonna move on. We got more to cover. Next thing I'm going to talk about is the yeast profile. Obviously, this is going to have a giant impact on your beer. If you're brewing a Hefeweizen, you have limited options of what you're going to use. If you're doing more of an American style or experimental, then the door is wide open. You can do a lot of different stuff. With yeast strains, same thing. Just for one, there's a lot of information, from the lab, from the providers of the yeast. Look at their notes on it. I don't always agree with them, but it's going to get you in a good place. If there's one to start with, you have to make sure you get your right temperatures for that. Mess with different degrees of different temperatures, and you will get extremely different beers depending on how you ferment this thing. But the biggest thing is you want to make sure it's an extremely healthy environment for that yeast. You want to have it nice and sanitary. You want to have as much oxygen, or the correct amount of oxygen. If you're not doing pure oxygen and you're shaking the carboy, safely shake the hell out of it, but don't hurt yourself. If you're repitching, just make sure you have a proper amount of yeast cells that you're pitching. If you're checking your cell counts, if you're up to that level, then you'll kind of know where you're at with your yeast pitches. If not, you can kind of start to pitch by volume, but just you'll know your yeast. Generally, if you're repitching, within 2 weeks, you want to use that yeast. It drops down dramatically after that second week. So you'll start to notice a change in it. It'll go from its nice milky, creamy color and start to get a little bit more brown and stuff. At that point, you're either going to have to toss it, or you can make a little starter, give it some reserves, give it some more zinc, some nutrients, and fill that thing up. But you want to have a strong, healthy, clean environment, strong, healthy yeast, and then depending on what you're doing, so just experiment with different flavors. Get back to the Hefeweizen yeast. I've experimented between 60 degrees, 62 degrees, up to 71 on different strains, and getting massively different flavors. Depends on what you want out of it. That's the biggest thing. I can't give too much advice on it besides experiment, try new things out, and just record it. Figure out what you want to do, what you want out of that yeast. But just make sure it's healthy. Make sure you have enough yeast. You can do all this stuff for recipe formulation. Try to make the best beer possible. And if you mess up on yeast, the beer is going to be garbage anyway. So, yeah.
So you might as well drink it.
Might as well do it right.
Yeast makes the beer.
Yeah. So, another thing I want to get into is water chemistry.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How can you overpitch your yeast? And if you can, what is that? What would you call that variable between underpitched and overpitched?
I'm not as worried about overpitching because you have to really overpitch to start causing some problems. Underpitching will make an immediate impact. If you underpitch, then it's going to stress the yeast a lot. You're going to get a lot more esters. Maybe something you want out of certain strains, but most of the time, no. I'd much rather overpitch any day. If you start to overpitch, you can it can pick up some other different flavors. You're more prone to autolysis, probably with more yeast in the solution, in your wort. But it would take a lot to overpitch on that.
And you say it doesn't take much to be under. Like, do you have a percentage ish?
I like to use, I'm trying to think of the ratio now. I think it's 1 billion cells per milliliter of, I have to look up the exact, I have it written down. I'm from Kentucky, so I don't remember everything, just bear with me. But it's around, I think, like 1 billion cells per milliliter of, I'll email you guys later. But yeah, like I said, as far as under pitching, go to 0.775 of that, and you can start to notice some differences. Again, I don't know why I keep going back to the Hefeweizen one, but that's one we experiment with, and I like to underpitch that because I'm a big fan of more banana flavor as opposed to the clove. Just personal preference, and underpitching that kind of yeast will help stress those certain esters that they really bring out that banana flavor. So,
Thanks.
Anyone else with any yeast questions?
The oxygenation of the
Yeah.
wort. How do you do that? By minutes? By how do you figure out?
So if you want to get like really into it, you can get an oxygen meter. We're not stoned, so we don't have one. We use pure oxygen, and I've done it from working at different breweries. I've made a point to focus on the visual first and see, okay, if this is 25 ppm going in, I know what that looks like. So we have our line running in, that's what I'm trying to hit. And it's very hard to over-oxygenate the beer as well. People talk about it, and you read a lot of stuff saying, oh, don't over-oxygenate your beer, it's going to ruin everything. If I've never over-oxygenated a beer, it's near impossible. I've been 10 gallons in and flowing out of a 90-gallon fermenter foam. Beer still came out all right. So again, you just want to make sure you have enough. I do it as a visual. If you're shaking it, you're probably going to get 5 ppm of dissolved oxygen in the solution. You can attach a mixer to a drill if you want to get into it, maybe get up to 10. The best way is to get pure oxygen going into it. Just watch your visual. You don't want to foam up your carboy or fermenter too much, but just watch your levels.
Use a stone.
Yeah, we have a center stone coming out of our heat exchanger. Just have a pure oxygen line into it, and then just kind of gauge the levels from there. But we don't have the capabilities to test them out yet.
Like your homebrew is a little bit different.
A little bit. When I was home brewing, I've done both. I shook the carboy, and then I had a centered stone, little oxygen running in. Did that for 5 minutes. Let it go, just let it bubble up, and good to go.
I've gotten a lot of different answers to this question, so I assume that there isn't one specific answer, but is there a specific advantage or disadvantage to pitching dry yeast or like rehydrating a dry packet, in your opinion?
I don't have a whole lot of experience with dry yeast. I just always lean more towards liquid.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of people there's a lot of breweries that use dry yeast. We've used it once here, and it was one of the best saisons we've done. The thing just rock out. As long as you have enough of it, you rehydrate it, give it enough proper environment, then I think it's just more about preference. But to me, I'm really about just pure ingredients, and for some reason I think that the liquid form has less process to it. So I lean more towards using that. But you can still make good beer with the dry yeast.
I mean, I've done both, and I've never really noticed too much of a difference. And supposedly there's something about like the cell walls of the yeast not being damaged when you do like a rehydration. But as long as you're not shocking the yeast when you put it into the wort itself, that's the most important thing. So make sure when you're pitching that dry yeast, you're just pitching at pitching temp as opposed to 85 or 90 degrees.
I was reading a study from Fermentis saying that the dry yeast today, the process is so technological that you can just throw it dry and you just absorb it and hydrate right there. So you don't have to put in the water and mix like 30 Celsius, whatever. It's made for you to just dry it. Use it dry.
You had mentioned underpitching for Hefeweizen.
Yeah.
How much do you, like? How do you know like what's the like underpitch to get like banana out of it?
I would probably start with about 75% of what you normally do. And you can start working your way down off of that, maybe to about 50% if you really want to stress it. That's about, I'm usually between 50% and 75% of my normal pitch is what I'll do for that, to really stress that.
It's a trade secret.
I'm still trying to perfect it. I don't know.
What I'm doing next though.
Anybody else?
For your sours, what do you guys use? Do you use lacto and kettle sour? Or?
Yeah, so right now for our sours, we kettle sour. I'll use, honestly, a lot of good belly, but I'll also add in some different strains. I'll probably use Plantarum's a beast, but I use probably about 7 different strains of lacto now. I make a little mixture. And
do you guys I don't know, build your grain bill to have more sugars for it to work with? I've used good belly a few times and it just like ferments through everything. Yeah. It's delicious at the end, but it just really hulks out on it.
It's funny. Like for me lately, I've been less happy with the Plantarum.
Really? Yeah.
But like I said, I'm using 6 other strains now to kind of compensate on that.
Yeah.
If I was doing a mixed fermentation, I would definitely consider that. I'd kind of bulk it up and use more raw, do some more oats and wheat in there to give it more stuff to chew on.
Yeah.
I haven't noticed a big difference in a lot of the kettle sours we're doing.
Okay.
But I do use a lot of wheat in them to begin with. Yeah, so the majority of them, except for actually the one coming out, that one's been our lowest. That one's almost hit 3.1 pH, so I'm ecstatic.
Wow.
But yeah, generally, it's maybe like 40% or so wheat I'll have in the kettle sours to begin with.
Yeah.
But I haven't noticed it like going nuts like that. But there's so many different variables too that.
Yeah, we've just, I think our, once we mash, we've just not boiled down far enough afterwards. So we've gotten 8 gallons of mash for a 5-gallon finished product. And it has just fermented all the way through everything.
Really?
And then we get
where's it sitting at after the
we
kettle sour?
get 3% potential, less than that. And it was starting at 5% potential.
Yeah.
Maybe check the process. There could be something else getting in there.
I'm using buckets for my primary, so it could be some yeast in there.
My guess is there might be something else getting in somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's sour, so you're not noticing right off the bat.
Right. What temperature do you guys kettle sour?
Depends on the strain, lacto.
Yeah.
I like to use Plantarum between 85 and 100. Generally around 85 to 90. Different strains work better at 110, 100.
Right.
So it depends on the strain we're using. When I'm doing my blend, I try starting around 100, and I drop down to about 85.
Okay. Have you noticed a difference between the different good belly flavors?
Flavor-wise, no. I'm just overall I've noticed less production out of it. That's why I've started adding in different blends.
Yeah, I got a bottle of the probiotics,
Okay.
so I'm gonna try and use that in the next batch.
Yeah.
But because it's just powdered,
I've just started having to up my percentage of lacto that I use to get the pH level out. Yeah.
White labs, they have some lactobacillus soup.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like complexity when I'm doing even doing kettle sours, so I'll add in multiple strains and experiment with temperatures and pitch rates and stuff like that. So that's the biggest thing. There might be something you're picking up somewhere else that's because I haven't known lacto to do that much.
It might be because when I was doing the initial batches this year, it was colder, and I have my shop with a space heater, and that's how I'm keeping the temp up at 90 to 100, And now that it's hotter out, I think it's just fermenting through more of it, or maybe some of the other yeast strains or something is just getting active. I don't know. but the last few batches it's just fermented right through,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, you know.
And you're not controlling the fermentation, no?
Start with that.
I mean, they're all delicious, but they're just not what I want it to be,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, no worries. All right. So I'm gonna move on to water chemistry. How many people in here mess with their water chemistry? Half a room or so, a little bit more. Perfect, awesome. So water chemistry, it's one of the easiest things to overdo when you're creating your recipe, when you're brewing in general. But it's a really important step to try to figure out, and it's something you don't want to start messing with until you actually understand it. I equate it to you're making a pasta sauce at home. You have your marinara. You add a little bit of salt, makes it a little bit more crisp, makes it pop. It's awesome. Add a little bit more, and it's garbage. It's extremely easy to mess up your water profile. So you kind of want to have a good grasp of it. It annoys the crap out of me when I'm reading different recipes, and people are like, oh, 5 tablespoons of gypsum here, and use your sulfate. All this you don't know what the original water profile is unless you're going completely RO and building it up. So the biggest things you want to check in your water if you want to start to get into it. First off, you want to know if there's chlorine in it. It's Florida. It's got chlorine in it, so you want to filter that out. You want to know your carbonates. You want to know how much calcium is in that water. Once you know these things, you'll know the hardness of it. You'll kind of you can get it sent off. I think it's like a $30 test. In a lot of different places. I've used Ward Labs before as well. There's homebrew tests, home kits, but you can kind of get a general idea of what's coming in on your water report. The biggest thing, like I said, is checking your chlorine level, checking your carbonates. You can build it up from there. If you know your sulfate level, if you know your calcium and your chloride, then you can build up your recipe. So what I like to do is we have a 3-stage filtration unit here. It's not quite reverse osmosis, but it does filter down a lot of stuff to where pretty much I don't have to add anything to my Pilsners because it's around that level. And I like to build up each recipe to that. When I first started doing water, when I first was homebrewing, we were just using a Brita filter. We were filtering our water, brewing with that. Our stouts, our brown ales, maltier stuff tasted great. IPAs, pale ales were okay, but it was missing something. It was a little muddled, a little muddy. So that's when I started diving more into the water chemistry and started to learn about adding more sulfates, getting your chloride to sulfate ratio right. If you add more of your chlorides, what I use here is calcium chloride. That'll bump up my calcium, bump up my chloride. That's going to help your malt come out. It's going to help your beers be more on the maltier side, help that kind of pop out. You start to get higher sulfates. That kind of helps your hops. You can make that a little bit crisp. Make those hops stand out a little bit more and make your bitterness clear a little bit. So once I started learning about that ratio, started building up the water profile is when our pale ales or IPAs really started to take a turn and be where I want it to be. Like I said, it's really easy to overdo, but it's something to kind of pay attention to, and if you start tweaking it, figure out what your start is. Don't just add something because somebody said it. Figure out where your start point is, build up off of there, and then kind of expand, learn, brew the same recipe with one way and then do it with a degree of water. You'll see difference. Whether it's good or bad, you'll understand what you're doing and kind of make it better for the next time.
Yeah, it's the important question of why am I adding this?
Exactly. Don't do it just because someone says.
Yeah.
I guess the biggest thing I want to stress about learning your malts. Oh, somebody said add a pound of this. Why? What's it doing? Once you know that, then you can make that decision of whether you need to add it or not. So that's an extremely basic description of what we do for water profile, but it's enough for you to dive into and kind of mess around with.
If you want to read the book, don't.
It's a page turner.
It's painful.
I've been reading it for 2 months. And
Every time you're on my
It's got a lot of good information. It is very technical, and if you're not more chemistry, biology minded, it'll take know,
Well,
guys like me a
there's parts
while,
I
but
read through that say, you know, as a home brewer, I really don't need to understand how to calculate this.
exactly. And the basis is if you understand these core concepts, okay, this is how much hardness is in my water. This is what a sulfate chloride is. Your magnesium is going to take care of itself. Your, sodium is pretty much going to be what it is unless you reverse osmosis. So
You need to wait 20 to 30 minutes before you check your pH, because it's gonna change.
it's all temperature dependent,
Yeah.
which is a great segue. I appreciate that because we're going to talk about pH now. So your pH is the measure of acidity in water, generally related to hydrogen, iron concentration. We don't have to talk about that. But what you're doing is you're measuring that acidity. Generally on a scale of 0 to 14, 7 obviously being neutral, 0 going to be your acid, your acidity, and 14 going to be your alkaline. Your alkalinity on that. So, in general, most of your city water is coming through about 6.5 to 8.5 pH scale. When you're mashing in, you're looking to hit 5.2 to 5.6 range of pH. That's kind of the sweet spot for your conversion of sugars. You get a little bit higher than that, you're going to start having a problem picking up tannins and stuff you don't want in your beer.
What number is that again?
5.2 to 5.6. Generally, you fall within there, you're gonna be a good spot. Your darker beers are already gonna be a little bit lower because you're adding in roasted barley, your chocolates, your highly roasted malts to actually bring down that acidity. Let's see where I'm at here. So the pH kind of really affects a lot. So when you're mashing in that 5.2 to 5.6 range, you're trying to give those grains the optimal situation for that enzymatic activity, which is in essence gonna take care of your conversion. You got the proper conversion. Also having the pH affects efficiency, protein coagulation, your lauter, viscosity, stability, haze, fermentability, attenuation, color clarity, pretty much everything you do in the beer. And your yeast. So the good news is, without getting too deep into it, is the pH. You can set that at the beginning. If you have your proper your water concentration, your pH is right in your mash, you're going to be set up for the rest of the brew, because if everything else is correct, it should start taking care of itself. One thing I like to do is acidify my sparge water as well, because so if I'm mashing at 5.2, everything's great. I start sparging with an 8.5 pH water, it's going to start raising that pH of that mash. What that's going to do is lead you to more tannins picking up, less conversion and stuff going on there. So you don't want to extract any of that. I like to try to keep it where it was. So I'll acidify the sparge water a little bit.
Use your acid lactic?
I use lactic acid.
Yeah.
You can use phosphoric as well.
Use also on the mash?
Yep. So I'll treat all my water going in for the beer. I'll treat the mash. I'll acidify the sparge water. And something I like to do in the general scope of having the whole profile is I'll save some of my calcium and some of my chloride for the boil. Make sure it shoots into the fermenter. What that does is gives the yeast more nutrients, more health. It helps make sure that it transfers in the mash. Not every mineral you add goes from the mash tun to the boil kettle. So you want to make sure there's enough left over to give it what you want. So I'll leave a little bit.
You said you added it to the fermenter?
No, I'll add it to the sparge water. I'll add it to the kettle and the mash tun.
Okay.
And generally, once I add to the boil, I'll make sure that I know that's going into the.
So all your nutrients are in or at least in the boil. Okay.
Yeah.
You ever experiment with the 5.2 stabilizer?
Once.
I've heard
So
bad
it can
things
get you
about
where
it.
you need, but
Yeah.
in my experience, it's just kind of like, you're throwing something on the wall, you're hoping it works, and you don't know why. I'd rather know why. And I'd rather make sure it's kind of like, insurance because I didn't do this, and that. Why not do A, B, and C so I don't need this? So I'll make sure my water profile is right, I'll make sure my pH is right, and I don't have to worry about that because I know I'm right in the mash.
Good point.
So in How to Brew, actually, there's a chart that shows SRM versus pH contribution. How accurate would be something like that be? I mean, I looked at that and I used a Crystal 20 malt.
Yeah.
And it said I was gonna come out around 5.3, and I did. I had some lactose standing by, but I actually hit it. So how accurate are those kind of charts?
I know pH will affect your color to the extent I wouldn't
Right.
say it's huge.
Right.
Um,
Well, they used to say the grain you're using, the color affects the pH.
the
That's
color
what
effect.
was
The I would say maybe that's true more for your darker malts, because that's just darker malts are going to lower that pH and in turn affect the color. But that's something I've never worried about. Is my pH is 5.3, I'm going to be off 5 to 6. You know what I mean? Like it's
Right.
Your software usually takes that into account when you're building things, and if you're ever playing around with water, you have to know how much dark grains versus light grains you have, the volume of water, all that stuff, and you won't be able to come up with a calculation for the pH of the mashes unless you know those things.
Right.
So there's definitely a correlation, and those are used in your software usually.
Do you usually do like the same beer style and do like 5.2 pH and then another batch with like 5.5? Like, have you noticed a difference, or have you done that?
Not enough detail to tell you I've noticed a giant difference. My main goal is to get in that range. Normally I'm around that 5.2, 5.3. It's on my list of stuff to mess around with, to start tweaking the water profile to get a higher range versus a lower range. I haven't been able to experiment enough to know that big a difference on it. But there are brewers that really get high into it.
Because I've had people were having like, well, for IPAs I have 5.3, and then for stout I have like,
Give them a beer side by side with it.
Right.
What else? All right. So the last thing is to discuss when we're going through building your recipe, formulate. You have everything else. It's just adding different adjuncts as well. Can really accentuate the beer, and it's a highly varied field. You could be talking about using fruits to different herbs and spices to vanilla. I have different things I do for different beers. It really takes experimentation. Like most of my herbs and spices I like to throw in the boil. If I'm doing something more delicate with fruits and vanilla or things, like to preserve that flavor more, that it's going to boil off. I try to tend more towards secondary additions and stuff like that. The best thing with that is just kind of take even fruits. The amount of raspberries I'll use versus the amount of strawberries I use is going to vary greatly, because raspberries pick up a lot more flavor. Strawberries I have to fill up my 7-barrel fermenter, and it's a hell of a day cleaning out that fermenter. So you take all that into consideration when you're building your grain bill. What you expect out of the additions. Do you want more sweetness? Do you want some spice coming added in? Do you want more dryness out of that? It's really going to affect what you do with your hops, with your malt, with other sugars involved in there. So you kind of have to look at it as a picture you're painting and make adjustments accordingly. Questions?
Do you have a favorite resource that kind of helps you understand which adjuncts are best, or how they behave in different stages of the brew, like the mash versus boil versus primary, secondary, okay?
Yeah. Besides experimenting, your standard brewing literature with like extreme home brewing has a lot of like base, stipulation of what to use, different random spices and stuff. So if I'll start with that. I'll do that. I'll research stuff online. I'll look at the fruit or whatever. I'll get some of it and mess with it. Like I know, last year we had to brew a Bloody Mary Goza. We did for Central Florida Top Brewer.
Where's Carol?
So I've used ginger before, but this one I was going to use horseradish. So just kind of experimenting. All right, I know what I use for ginger. I'm estimating horseradish to be at least 4 times stronger than that. And it's
What makes you decide putting it as like a secondary addition as opposed to a boil addition?
So with in that specific scenario, like the horseradish, the ginger, I know I use ginger in the boil. It's a strong flavor. I'm not worried about boiling a little bit of it off. If it's more delicate, I'm going to lean more towards secondary to preserve those flavors. but I'm also a big proponent in trying a little bit in the boil. And if it's not enough, you can always go back to secondary and add more into it. So
It's easier to put more in than take it out.
you can't take it out unless you brew another batch. Yeah.
Do you think dried fruit works better in boil or in secondary?
I don't use a lot of dried fruit. I
Good
always.
for that one.
Which one?
The La Passenger Noir.
No fruit.
No, there's
Actually,
the,
no, I take it back. Take it
There's
back.
the dried fruit.
Yeah.
There's figs.
Take it back. You're right.
There's figs,
You're right,
dates,
right.
and golden raisins.
And that one I did use. I used those in secondary.
Secondary?
Yeah, muddled up.
Okay.
The original one didn't use fruit, so I apologize.
You usually want to capture the bright, fresh flavors of the
Yeah,
fruit.
they're dried, so they're different.
Yeah, they're not going to taste the same. You don't my berry, they might have sulfates in them. Why bother?
I tried to avoid those ones.
I've experimented. Last year we used dried tart cherries for the first time. I did it in the boil. We poured a little bit of wort off. I let it steep, made it a little tea, and blended it back in. It had a better flavor than I thought it would. That I thought I would get from normally just adding in secondary. So there's definitely room for it.
Do you need volunteers to help print these experimental brews?
I normally throw them up.
The ones that you're not going to make again?
Bob, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you cold crash with the fruit inside?
Sometimes. It depends strictly because of our setup. Generally, yes. With our setup here, we have 2 7-barrel stainless fermenters. We have 5 3-barrel plastic fermenters. I can't crash in those. So I'll rack off with the fruit and then cold crash. The 7-barrel and other ones, then yeah, I'll cold crash, transfer it off. All right. So, Ebola, if you want to start getting those ready, actually, sorry. The last thing to talk about is just think about your total recipe formulation is your carbonation. You got to think about: do you want a bottle condition? Do you want to keg this beer? What's the carbonation going to look like? You have to know what your final volume is going to be like. What do you want that to be? So generally, like this, the rule of thumb, I just think around 2.5 volumes of carbonation. If you're doing higher carb beers, your Belgians, your FAs and stuff like that, then you're going to go a little bit higher carbonation. You just have to pay attention to how much priming sugar you're using. If you're bottle conditioning, or if you're kegging, it's a little bit easier. You can kind of set the CO2 volumes. If you know the temperature, you can let it roll. Or you can get weird and just shake it for a while at 30 psi and hope you don't mess it up.
Yeah. Does not always have the best results.
I've done all 3. I think they got a video of me the other day. There's one that we were messing around with. I'm standing on it, shaking it. It all works, but you just want to kind of make sure. Like that's the easiest one to kind of go by style guidelines. Don't go by what you like. Like I said, generally for me, our beers, most of them I'll get around 2.5, and then deviate from there depending on style. But I just want to have enough mouthfeel on it. I don't want you get too much carbonation, you're going to get some carbonic bite. Add some other flavors that you're not trying to pick up, but also you don't want it too flat unless you're going for more of an English style or you're doing cask ales and stuff like that. You want to try to pick up those more subtle nuances. So just have a game plan going in, adjust accordingly. So the kind of the biggest takeaways that I want to reiterate: one, envision what you want to brew, work your way backwards. Know your ingredients, strive for balance. If your balance is off, one, you've used too little of something, then why are you adding it? You're not going to be able to taste it. It's just going to muddy up the beer. If you use too much of it, it's going to distract all the other flavors in that beer. It's going to take away from what you want to do. So, big thing I like to do is strive for balance. You can get as weird as you want. You can add as much crazy stuff as you want, but if one thing's sticking out over the others, that's all you're going to notice, and I think it just kind of takes away from the whole point of it. Know your system, know your capabilities, know what numbers you're going to hit. That's going to be the biggest way to help you get your recipe, structure that out properly. Give yeast the best condition possible, a healthy fermentation, and record keeping. It's vital. It's the only way you can improve. If you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, then you're not going to improve the next one. You're just going to keep changing stuff and not know why. So change one thing at a time, and then you can calculate those changes. Yes, sir.
Temperature on a natural carbonation.
Um,
You've got a cold crash, and then you're gonna take it, and you wanna bring the temperature back up, so you activate the yeast, so you start getting carbonation.
For like bottle conditioning?
Bottle conditioning, yeah.
I mean, room temperature, you're going to get, the higher you go, the faster it's going to carbonate. So you could say, room temperature, even or cellar temperature, between 50 and 70 degrees. I wouldn't go higher than that. If you start to get upwards of 70, 80 degrees, you're going to pick up different flavors. It's going to condition faster, but it could create some bottle bombs as well.
Keyword bottle
Yeah.
bombs.
You can also get diacetyl at 7. And you start getting some off flavors.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that can happen with it. You got, and that goes into if you're repitching yeast before your bottle conditioning, then I would say you can be more prone to diacetyl if you don't have the right pitch counts and you're doing it at the wrong temperature.
Yeah.
If you're just doing it at secondary, like you're not adding extra yeast, then probably not as much prone for diacetyl reasons, but you're still going to pick up some stuff you probably don't want. I would keep it between 50 and 70 degrees.
50, I was surprised 50 actually works. I didn't think it was going to.
It'll go a little bit slower. It might take another week or two, but we'll get there. Yeah.
You can even cold crash gelatin and then bottle it, and it will condition, but it takes a
Take a while.
Yeah, it's not got that much viable yeast in there as you would beforehand. Your gelatin
Most of the time you're going to be cold crashing and then bottling and letting it warm back up to your room temperature.
12-ounce vessels warm up pretty quickly.
Yep. It won't take long.
Nope.
So the last thing I want to do with you guys, we'll get some samples ready. I kind of just wanted to go through one of our recipes and just talk about why I did what I did. We can taste it and talk about all the stuff that went into it and my thought behind it and why we made that beer. So I will start passing these out, and Lola is going to start passing out some samples. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Here, actually, Alex, could you give me a hand on that side?
He's got it now. Oh, yeah, I guess. Sit back down.
Wow.
Oh, there's two.
Take it away,
Crystal 100.
No, just serve that our better.
What is that?
I can print some more out too.
That's from my fat gather, and it takes like liquid.
That's the color edition right there, the roasted bar.
2.5, and then I bottle, 10 liters, and then.
This is from Morrow water, or is it base?
I think we have to
Something? Yeah, exactly. It's like we go all together like last week chaos. If someone wants to say we can drink it, we don't go through the process.
The grain bill changes, so it's always changing.
All right. Everybody have a sheet and sample jar?
I definitely.
Perfect. So, you've all noticed this is our Kevin's Irish Goodbye. This is Irish Red Ale. There's more samples here if I need the other ones. So, start from the beginning. My thought process behind this was I wanted to brew a traditional Irish red ale. I wasn't going to get too crazy with anything else. I just wanted to brew something. I wanted to throw it on nitro, obviously, so there's a carbonation aspect. But I just kind of envisioned it as more of a traditional style. Worked my way back from there. Like a traditional Irish ale is kind of known for it's balanced, but it's got a obviously more of a malty flavor to it. A little dryness from roasted barley, has that typical Irish dry character to it. Little subtle nuances of the toast and caramel. So taking that into account is when I started working back, figuring out my recipe for it. So starting with my my base malts, I start with 2-row, essentially 80% 2-row. You can also substitute this and use, like I said, more indigenous ingredients. I could have used some British pale ale malt. I could have used some Irish pale ale malt. Stuff could have maybe helped a little bit more on the round flavor on that. Let's say I substituted, I'll put a little bit of Munich malt in there to help round out those toasty caramel, not really caramel, but more of those toasty, nutty flavors. Is why I added in the 8% of the Munich malt there. Then I use a combination of the Crystal 40 and the Crystal 60. Crystal 40 gives a lot of that straight. If you're looking for a typical caramel flavor, Crystal 40 is a good one to start with. Crystal 60 is going to have that caramel, but a little darker flavor to that. It's a little bit more intense caramel flavor. So I use a combination of those to kind of pick up those subtle nuances that I was looking for in the beer.
You weren't shooting for Crystal 100, right?
Was that?
You weren't shooting for Crystal 100.
I was
right?
not shooting for Crystal 100. Got printed off wrong? Is that what it is?
No, you made the statement earlier that adding Crystal 60 and Crystal 40.
Oh, yeah, gotcha. I was not treating for Crystal 100. You're correct. So, and I added in that Victory malt in there to, as like I said, more of that signature malt that's gonna pop up that like a little heavier, toasty, nuttier flavors. So I use the crystals and the Victory really to give me those subtle nuances that I want in the beer. And then finish it off with the roasted barley. The roasted barley and the Crystal 60 also play a big part in trying to help get the reddish color in the beer. Start to look at it, it is, what is it, 14 SRM. Between 13 and 16 is where I really like to be for red ales.
Is this Carafa special?
Nope.
When you say roasted?
Nope,
No, it
just
says
straight,
roasted barley?
yeah, just grease roasted barley. So that's kind of where I like to be. I think I'm on 14 here. I think it's a little bit more on the lighter end of the redder styles. The darker you go up a couple SRMs, you're going to get more of those darker hues, those deep hue, red hue notes and stuff. My OG, I was shooting for around 1057, final gravity of 1013. And then the IBUs at 21, trying to keep the style there. I used to use a single charge of Magnum, 60 minutes to try to round it out to that 21 IBUs. My water profile, the main things I'm looking for here, I made a balanced profile. Trying to promote the maltiness, but I want enough sulfates that helps that dryness a little bit and helps that balance. I didn't want this thing to be super sweet, so that's why I kind of made it more of a balance. I have my calcium at 106, chloride at 71. I'm trying to get at least both of those over 50 ppm in my beer. That's going to help promote fermentation, but also help promote enough of those minerals I need to balance the beer out. The sulfate is 99, again, keeping this thing really balanced, kind of a more balanced profile, so it's helping all that stuff pop out without the hop shining or the malts taking over too much. I was really looking for subtleties. Good.
This may be a tricky question. I know that ahead of time. When you're altering water chemistry for a traditional or a classic style like this, for example, are you doing it to mimic the water that was like originally used for this style, or are you creating that water chemistry to promote exactly what it is that you're looking for in the beer?
It's a combination of both. You have to be careful when you're trying to mimic water profiles from other countries and regions, because a lot of stuff you'll find online are current water conditions, and it's completely different from what that style was created for. You gotta try to find what that initial style was made for. But when I'm doing like stuff like this, and I'm doing like traditional Belgian style ales, I'll lean more towards creating water profiles from that city, or what that style is known for. but I also want to accentuate the characteristics. So I know that if I bring my calcium and chloride up to these levels, I'm going to accentuate that maltiness. And if my sulfates, the SO4 there, my sulfates, if that's not over 100 up to 150 is around the range I'm starting doing my IPAs. I don't want it at that point, but I want enough balance, so I'll put it around, between 50 and 100. You're going to try to get that balance of the sulfates. So a little bit of both. But this one is trying to be middle of the road, just balanced profile.
So that's a good question, because I noticed like with Beersmith, like version 3, they have all the different target profiles you can go for.
Yeah.
Do you ever just go for like the malty amber or the hoppy light, or the different colors?
Not so much anymore. When I first started, I would definitely look at those and try to get my baseline of where I'm going. And now I think I just have a grasp on it. I know what I want out of the beer. Unless I'm recreating a specific profile that I want, then I'm going to go with that. But otherwise, I know my ranges of what I've used before, what's worked for me. So I tend to do my own thing now.
That's awesome.
What do you use to get the numbers on the water?
There's a really great resource, Brewer's Friend. They have a mash water profile. There's 2 different levels. The one's like their mash profile, which you can plug in your water content, and it helps you adjust your sparge pH if you want to do lactic acid.
I got you.
phosphoric
So
acid.
you test, you got a base level, and you just plug that in.
Correct.
That same resource that also has a good one for Orange County, for the area. Yeah, and they have some of the different
About
like
the
East
Carbonation
Orange
of
and West.
Toyota.
Yeah, so that's a really good resource.
Then you're going to send it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, that Brewer's
Even
Friend
water
has a lot of great
is
tools
great.
and stuff that you guys are using.
Is there a specific conversion rate from like AAU to like ounces or pounds or anything? Because I noticed that it doesn't say like specific.
Yeah. So yeah, going into the house, the best way to do it is by your alpha acid units. What's going to take into account your gravity, the amount of time the hop is boiled, and the alpha acids of the hop. So there is a calculation you can use for that. But there's a big, like IBUs, like we even use it here. I try to give as much education as possible, but you guys know like IBUs can be misleading. I could have something at 70 IBUs, but you think it's extremely malty. That could be, start with the water profile, but your malt, the alcohol content, how strong the beer is, everything's going into it. So here's your IBUs versus, or your bitterness units versus your gravity units ratios you can look at. But really, it's also the biggest thing I would say is whatever system you're using, stick with that, make notes, and then use that as you grow. And this is going to kind of be unless you're sending every beer you do off to get lab analysis on, and exactly what your IBUs are, stick with one thing. And then to you, if this tastes like 31 IBUs, then it's 31 IBUs, and you know how to adjust your recipes accordingly.
Do you specifically recommend crafting recipes looking at AAU, or for example, like I'm brewing a beer and I put in my hop profile and it is within IBU range, so that's what I'm going to go with? Like, does that make sense? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like I shoot for, when I design the recipe, I shoot for a target IBU, but I'm going to use the AAU number to get me there. So every time, like, it is, especially with you guys, it changes probably a lot more than I do, because you're getting a lot of stuff from homebrew shops and in different places that the alpha acids change. Whatever hop you get, you have to adjust your recipe. Just because you used 4 ounces last time when you're dry hopping, or bad example, but using 4 ounces or 1 ounce one time, you may get that hop in from a different crop year, from a different farmer. It's going to be different. If it's 10% alpha acids one time and it's 6 the next time, you can't use the same one because it's not going to convert. So I just like to use, if I use an AAU, you know the utilization. I know what I'm looking for. I know if I want 21 IBUs at 60 minutes, it doesn't matter what the hop is that comes in. If it's 6.8 alpha acids or 8.6, I know I can use this enough to get 21 IBUs from that. So I think what you can get in trouble in is kind of trying to convert that without paying attention to the AAUs. You can like, oh, I plugged this recipe into Beersmith. I had 75 IBUs this time. I have 70 this time, and just start adding those IBUs in random places. It's going to change the beer. You really want to pay attention to the amount of IBUs you're putting into each edition, and focus on that when you're changing recipes. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Something I want to add to that too is a point you came back to earlier, which is knowing your system, knowing your equipment. One of the biggest things that will influence your IBUs is your chilling process. Are you able to get that beer chilled within 30 minutes, within 10 minutes, within 5 minutes? That isomerization process continues to happen even after the flame is out. So that can also have a big influence over the IBUs, because technically you're still isomerizing your hops for X amount of time after you turn that flame off.
Right, yeah.
So it's just like I said, learning your system, but the perceived bitterness plays a bigger role than a lot of texts previously stated. So try to figure out your perceived bitterness and what you taste. Like I said, when you're doing a hop bursting technique or you're dry hopping the hell out of something, there's beers with 0 IBUs that you can taste full hop profiles in. So just kind of pay attention to that perceived bitterness level, and whatever you're using to measure that, just do that continuously. Stick with one system so you know what you're training yourself for. And you can try commercial examples to start off as a baseline too. This says it's 40 IBUs, and that can be your baseline of what you know 40 IBUs as. But there's a lot of science not understood behind it too. So.
Yeah, my biggest challenge is ferment temperatures. I see on here you went from 71 to 4 days.
Yeah.
Now read online and everyone goes up and down, and I've done 45 batches and I'm lost on fermentation temperatures. I know at the rest I cold crash, but I see you ramp up into 4 days 71. I've never done that. Like, is that just by testing and see what the taste difference is, or do you have a resource?
For me, it's a diacetyl rest. What I found that just works best for me to completely get rid of diacetyl. I like to ramp up. Like I said, start ramping up that day 4 because primary fermentation's over. So we're going to start worrying less and less about the temperature of that primary fermentation. But I want to raise the yeast. So whatever you're fermenting at, I like to go 3 to 4 degrees above that, starting on day 4.
So your DOS is longer in mine then, so mine's probably too short.
I go day 4 to 7 on most of my beers. On our Bowen, for some reason, I have to go to almost day 10 sometimes. I can't tell you why on that particular one. It's nothing that I'm doing like crazy out of the ordinary, but I just learned different beers require different times. And that's when we have to do our diacetyl test to establish that. Why is this beer taking longer than the other? Let's test it, make sure it's gone before we crash it. Once we crash it, then we're causing a lot of other problems.
So have you found certain styles, or maybe I know certain styles you want that taste, but
I mean, mainly like for like our biggest one have been our Bowen, and then besides that, just yeast. Certain yeasts are prone to it. Like your English yellow yeast and stuff. The high attenuators, you want to make sure it's just you got to stay on it.
Kind of off that question, it's probably a little bit easier in your system here, but when you're doing your temperatures, to what range do you try to keep it? Obviously, if you keep it like right at 66, that's one thing, but if you let it have a range, how big of a range do you typically let it fluctuate before you reel back in?
I try, depending on the beer, if I can. It's a lot easier for me to control fermentation on our stainless fermenter. Within a degree.
Yeah.
I have it kicking on. If I want it at 68, if it hits 69, it's cooling back down. I try to really pinpoint that degree. The exceptions would be different beers. Like I'm doing a Belgian triple right now. That beer is so finicky. Like I let it go. I'll start at 62 and just let it climb. If it hits 75, and I try to touch it a little bit with the glycol, it just gets pissed off and shuts down completely. So I'll let it ride. The other beers, I'll start at a low base. I'm day 3, going day 4 now. I just hit my mid 70s. I'm gonna let that thing crank because I know the second I look at it wrong, it's gonna stop working. So depends on, right? Yeah, I'll let it go. But generally, yeah, I'll keep it. If I want it at 66 or 68, I'm gonna keep it right there. I'm gonna have it kicking on. It was just easier to do when you have a glycol jack in the system versus you're doing carboys, you're in the bathtub, or you're doing in an accuser and different stuff like that. So you want to, like, the best thing to do, I used to tape the probe to the carboy. You can also put a little thing of water in there and dip it down in there to try to get the temperature. Or unless you get some fancier equipment that goes inside the carboy, but I do my best to keep it as close as possible.
In terms of the malts, so like if you were to take this recipe and crank it up to a 10% ABV or like down to 3, would you keep the same like 80-20 ratio of base to specialty, or would you keep like the specialty more in terms of like pounds per gallon versus percentage?
Depending on what I wanted out of it,
Okay.
I'd probably tweak it a little bit. You could kind of start off by, taking those percentages and bumping them up till you get that. But that might bring some of my roasted barley and crystal malt over a threshold that I want it to. So I'd start tweaking it down from there. So I would take the base percentages and start bumping them, but I'd tweak it a little bit. Like if I was doing like a 10% beer out of this, my 2-row Munich would probably go up to maybe 85 or so. And start messing around, tweaking with that. I just don't want to get too much of the other malts in there. It's not just like a straight double.
Yeah, like is there like a max amount that you would recommend in terms of like pounds per gallon? Because like I did a 4.9% stout that I liked. Did like 2 pounds of various roasted malts. But if I wanted to do a 10% stout, I'm not going to jump it up to like 4 pounds of chocolate malt for 5 gallons.
That's where I would say like the percentages come into play. Like kind of convert that to what you use. Don't think of it just necessarily in pounds, but how much of that ratio are you using this malt to this beer? If you're gonna bump it up, then maybe try, like I said, bumping up to a 10% ratio. But look, if you do that and you have a crystal malt in there and it's at 15%, you may want to scale it back a little bit. It might have too much cloying sweetness and stuff like that. So it's kind of that's why I like to kind of look at things in terms of percentages to start off with. It helps you scale that up.
So I know Beersmith usually goes off of the alpha acid for bitterness and doesn't really pay attention to the beta acids at all. Do you pay attention to the beta acids, or like how so?
Honestly, not a lot.
No.
I'm getting more into it the more heavily hop beers we do. With a lot of stuff coming at late additions and dry hops, what I'm using versus boil additions. Looking at more like the cohumulone levels and stuff, like to add harshness. I don't want to add too much of that, but as far as betas, honestly, I haven't paid much attention to it. Any other questions? That's pretty much the end of all the stuff I wanted to go over, but I'm open to discuss anything else. Go ahead.
What are your thoughts on like an all-in mash? Like instead of doing your 1.5 water to grist, you just do your entire mash and sparge, and then don't
that
even.
one. Then you'd be jumping your 1.5 up.
Yeah.
And at that point you could be risking not enough conversion because there's too much space between those enzymes to start converting. I'd worry I'd lose some of that efficiency from there if you went too high.
So you just be afraid of losing efficiency.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you say that's where like brewing a bag efficiency drop is mostly coming from? Because with brewing bag you're doing like full volume mash.
It could be. I mean, Danny might more experience with this than I do. He's shaking his head yes. And you're not doing the full volume to brew in the bag. I know you guys still have like a sparge you're doing on the end of it, and I've talked to a lot of people that do that as well. I think not having a whole lot of experience, the biggest issue for me would just be the loss of efficiency and making sure that there's enough conversion and not too watered down to where the enzymes can't connect with all the starches.
But as like a home brewer, you're talking like maybe a $2 difference in your grain bill at most. But on a commercial scale, you're obviously talking
a lot
substantial
more.
difference. Yeah.
I'm not. I mean, I don't know. I'm never worried about brewing a beer because of cost. I go into it. I want to make the best beer possible. And so whatever that means, I want to do it. But I want to make sure if you're doing it and you're spending the money to do it, then I'll make sure the conditions are right for it. I mean, just off topic, but a random cool thing to try if you guys haven't. If you ever look at double and triple mashing, we're talking about mashing and using different ratios and stuff. So double mashing would essentially be you run your mash, you lauter it off, you don't sparge, you use that lauter as you take out the grain, mash it again, use that liquid, that wort, as your mash water. So it'll be a double mash. So no extra liquid water is added, just your wort. It literally, like, I didn't believe it the first time, it doubled our gravity. I went from 1075 to 1.150 just with using that. I had to sparge the second runnings because I didn't have that much yeast to make an 18% beer. But a really cool thing to do, and if you're looking at first runnings and experimenting with different processes of doing your mash, check it out. It's a little bit more technical when you're kind of planning out to begin with. Make sure you have enough water as backup and getting everything prepared for that, but it's a fun technique to try.
So you drain the water, you drain the mash, and then you just boil, mash again.
So no,
60
I think
minutes.
you take the wort off, water, no sparge.
Expanded grain out.
Then it's pretty much using two mashes. I'll clean that out.
Put
Put
new
grain.
grains?
New grain. Use that wort as my mash water. It's gonna be a thick mash, but if you want to, make a 18% beer,
Nice.
it's a good way to do it.
Russian barrel stout right there.
Yeah, without having to take doing 15, 20
Next meeting,
gallons of
everyone's
boiling
gonna have
water.
20% beers.
You can get full volumes.
Nice.
We're treating the
That's
April
similar
challenge
to saying
from
like
sours to double mash.
reiteration mashing in that aspect.
I'm not
My
familiar.
April beers.
The idea that I understood is that you divide your grain bill in half.
Okay.
You mash the first grain bill, so say it's like a 50-pound grain bill, you mash 25 pounds.
Yeah.
You take that off sparge, then you use the other mash on that to get the grain bill.
Yeah. That just sounds
Seems different in the aspect that you're using the wort as your sparge wort instead
Or
of
instead of new water, yeah.
So you're just kind of talking about splitting up so you can get the first runnings of
Yes.
yeah. This is going to double that.
Okay.
So if I were to do that, would I care to do more like specialty in the second mash to avoid like getting more of like the over tannins or anything like that?
I've done it the same way. Like I'll just use the same recipe and just split it. But I just split it, but just do the same way the second time.
Yeah.
I've been noticed. Like I was shocked. It was actually double.
Yeah, I mean, like, you're not boiling it, so you're not getting like
But you have to pay attention when you bring it over. You have to heat it to the right temperature for your strike again. It's gonna be a little bit more viscous, so pay attention to that. Pay attention to your mash temperatures.
So, like, have you had issues with pH with like the second mash, like because you're sparging or your second mash you're striking your wort, so your pH is going to be lower. Have you had issues with conversion in the second mash?
I haven't. I've only done it a couple times. No, I haven't. It was a barley wine when I did it. I got one. The other one was like a smash beer, so I didn't have a lot of dark grains and stuff to begin with. I can't remember the exact numbers on it, but it wasn't out of range.
The thing I've noticed, like with the second batch, because it's thicker and you're using more grain absorption, the second batch is much different.
It was the grain absorption was a lot different.
A lot less.
Yeah, because I think it has a lot to do with the sugar molecules or binding with the new grains, and it has a little bit more absorption, I would say, but hell, it still worked. It was crazy.
Did you have to adjust your water grist ratio if you wanted to do a second, or did you just top it off to account for the grain absorption?
I would plan to have to top it off. Hopefully you don't have to. It's gonna be. I would plan for a thicker mash, but have the water on standby in case you need to top it off.
Have you tried a party guard?
Sadly, I have not.
I've done a couple. I'm getting ready to
I'm all about it, and I'm definitely going to do it.
I'm a home brewer, 5-gallon batches. For me, with a party guy, I end up with 10 gallons, and it takes me about an hour to an hour.
Yeah.
So to me, I'm actually going to be doing a strong American ale and putting it in a barrel. But I'm going to do a party guy to come up with something that's around here, like 4 or 5% beer after that.
That's awesome. We did a really big beer the other day, and we had it double batching, and we were sad the whole time. Like, we could party gallon this and be here for 26 hours, but
I'm just playing with it and I have fun.
no, I think it's awesome. It's not only historical and help you with different styles, but
there's a lot to learn about how to do it.
It's efficient, but you can end up with 2-3 different beers off of the same grist. I love the idea.
I'm gonna try. I'm deciding to. Am I going to use? I can't fit all my grains in my. In my grain, my plant helps me make what 23 pounds.
I mean, if you're doing a beer like that, that's the way doing the double mash. You don't have to worry about maxing it out.
Right.
You can do a normal.
Well, you could actually do
twice
runnings into one pot, do a sparge for the second runnings into another pot, then use the first runnings for the.
Do that too.
Use half of my grain.
Might have to try something.
That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of brewing beer. You experiment, you can try new things out. If you're not learning, you're not improving. So good.
On a different line of question, do you find that there's a certain number of times you can reuse the same yeast even if you start it up each time?
Yep. Generally, we don't reuse yeast between over 8 to 10 times. Generally around 2 to 4 is going to be the sweet spot where that yeast is really conditioned to those environments. You're repitching it, it's ready to rock and roll. There's brewers that can use it for longer. With us, just with our setup, I start to notice more mutations once I get closer to that 8 to 10 cycle range. Then it's not worth reusing. I don't want to repitch on that. I notice less flocculation, less attenuation. You start to notice different change in flavors and stuff. So for us, that's about our sweet spot for our house strain. A lot of the specialty stuff we do, it's only 1 to 2 times, just because of there's probably like 4 different yeast strains, 5 different yeast strains we have up there right now, or maybe 6. But a lot of those I'll use once or twice because just style and stuff. We have our house yeast strain blend that we do, but besides that, I'll stick to
that. That's great though, because some breweries, their beers taste the same, unless there's the same yeast for everything.
That doesn't excite me.
No,
I like flavor. I like to experiment with different yeast. And it's that you get some breweries you have the red ale and the brown ale and the stout and the blonde. Close your eyes, you can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
You gotta switch it up.
Do you keep just like a few core strains and then vary it up with specialties, or do you just rotate all the time?
Yeah. So we have a couple core strains that we keep. I have a blend house strain that I use, and then like the specialties, I'll try to plan out my schedule where I can at least reuse it once, so I don't feel like a complete waste. I don't want to use it once and toss it, because I know that second generation is going to be even better than the third. So I'll try to plan out different beers accordingly. But generally, I have probably 1 to 2 yeast strains in the bank, and the rest is all going to just be new stuff coming in.
I got a broad question. Being a pro brewer now, you were a home brewer, what's the one thing you tell all of us that would affect our beers most? Is it temperature control, or?
Yeah, honestly, when we talk about recipe formulation, you can dial in your malts, you can dial in the hop and your utilization and what you want to use, but if you ferment it at 78 degrees, it's not going to be good.
So it's
control your fermentation temperature, control your sanitation, then dial in your malt profile, your hop profile, mess around with those techniques, and then mess with your water.
Would you say that temperature was like the biggest first major change that you noticed as a home brewer? Temperature control, or?
Oh yeah. I'll tell you a story. The first beer I brewed, I didn't know anything about it. Had a buddy. He's like, "I'll brew beer for him." Like, that sounds awesome. I love beer. And it's making. So we're making. We had no idea what the hell we were making. Like, just trying to do a beer. We fermented it in Ohio, like 30 degrees outside, put in the basement.
Straight malt.
It was 2%.
It was so thick.
I drank the hell out of it. I was obsessed. That's what started. I got obsessed with it after that. So yeah, I can attest to versus everything else. But knowing your system, knowing your ingredients, learning the process, is all key. Like when I say I used to stress out when I was homebrewing about, this is going wrong, what happens if this goes wrong. I'm doing it at this scale now. Everything possible has gone wrong, and I don't freak out. Like I know, like this is gonna break, this is gonna break, this is gonna break. Cool, we're fine. Like, we got this. Like when you start doing more, have backups, or know breweries in the area that you can come steal stuff from. But just relax. Like as long as the more confidence you get, the more knowledge, the more experience you get, the more you'll know your system, the more you know your ingredients. It's gonna help you formulate this beer, formulate your recipes. And whether you want to do clone recipes or you want to do your own thing, it's whatever you want to do is great. But just know what you're capable of producing and know your systems and keep it clean, keep it temperature controlled. Any other questions? All right.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you everyone at Bowigens for hosting us tonight. So cheers. Cheers. This is our second of our 6-course series, the masterclass series for the year. So Bobby actually hit on something really good, which was know your system. Chris Holland from Tactical Brewing is going to be doing a class on building a profile for your system and knowing your system. So that's actually a really great segue to one of our next classes. What time are you guys staying here until tonight? 10?
I have no idea what time it is.
About 9:30.
Yeah, another 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, so grab a beer and
if you guys have any questions, you feel more comfortable talking one-on-one, just let me know, hang out.
So thank you again.
Thank you.